Everybody, it's Christian from Human Risk, sitting in a beautiful autumnal London with something I think you'll find interesting. Now, I know that many of you that subscribe to my newsletter or are kind enough to follow me on social media work in the banking industry, so you're probably familiar with the story of Iqbal Khan. But if you're not, this is really worth checking out, and I'll give you the headlines in this video, but I'll also post some links that you can read a bit more details about the story, and it really is interesting from a human risk perspective. Now, Iqbal Khan was a business head at Credit Suisse. That's one of the two major Swiss banks. He recently announced that he was leaving to join arch rivals UBS. Full disclosure, that's my former employer. Nothing unusual in that move, I should add, because people often make the transition between those two firms. But what was unusual was two things. The first one was Khan's reason for leaving, and according to press reports, he got into a bit of a personal rivalry with the CEO. His boss bought a house next to him and did various things that suggested there was a depth of rivalry between the two men that you might argue was somewhat unhealthy. And so Khan resigns. He is put on gardening leave, a surprisingly short gardening leave for reasons nobody can quite make out. But he's on gardening leave, and obviously the purpose of gardening leave is to prevent you from poaching clients or poaching staff for your new place. And so he's going about his business on gardening leave. Notice he is being tailed by a car, so he confronts the people in the car that are tailing him. Turns out it's a detective agency that has been hired by Credit Suisse to follow him, presumably to make sure that he's complying with his gardening leave. He calls the police, who launch an investigation. That investigation takes on an entirely different turn because it turns out that one of the detectives involved commits suicide. And so this thing's taken a whole slightly more sinister turn. Now, what's interesting as well is that Credit Suisse launched an investigation into this particular appointment of the detective agency. The CEO was exonerated from that, so surprisingly didn't know, so they say, about the fact that a detective agency had been hired to do this, but the COO and the head of security resigned. So it's an interesting human risk story, both in terms of individual motivations, but also as we look at the behavior afterwards. I'm reminded very much of a simple human risk rule: just because you can doesn't mean you should. Possibly something they should have thought about before hiring the private detective agency. Now, I don't think we've heard the end of this story. It's going to run and run, so if you're not caught up with it, have a look now, and if there's any further updates in the story, obviously I'll bring them to you. Thanks for listening.